Hey guys, it's Mr. Mini Painter here, and today I am painting Thror, king of the lonely mountain Erebor, who leads this city into a prosperous town, which eventually gets destroyed because it attracts the dragon Smaug. You can see him here sitting on his throne, and I decided it was a fun challenge for me to recreate the throne as you see here. I made a 3D model out of it, and you can download it on my cults page. So to start painting this model, I primed it black. And as always, I start with the skin, the face in this case, with some Bugman's Glow. This Thror model is a beautiful model, and I loved him so much that I really wanted to have a nice diorama piece for him. So I created this 3D model of the throne. If you like it, you can 3D print it if you want. You can find the link to my cults page on in the description of this video actually. So for the second, I decided to do the eyes first, as they tend to be the most difficult, and I used palette witch flesh to paint in small white dots. They are so incredibly tiny with hobbits and dwarves that I rarely do it afterwards, after I finish the face, because I'm afraid to mess it up. So with some Abaddon black, I painted in the dots of the eyes. And as I said, this is always the most tricky part, so why not get rid of it right away? Afterwards, I used some Bugman's Glow and Kislev flesh to highlight the first stage of the face. And for this, I want to give him kind of a pale face because he lives under a mountain, let's be honest. He doesn't really see a lot of sunlight, right? So I started off with some light tones and highlighted those with some Kislev flesh. Focus on the recessed, on the raised areas, of course, not the recessed ones. So the nose, the cheekbones. And what you can do here is line them out and then use a watered down layer to kind of blend those colors together. You can do it with either a brighter tone or a darker tone, depending on what you want to achieve in your end result. And for him, I went for a pale face. Next, for the blues, there's some blue as a main tone, and I used a Night Lord's blue on those blue areas. This model is mainly blue and gold, so the robes are blue, parts of the sleeves on his arms are blue, and the inner part of the shield is blue. Later in this process, I also decided to do the helmet with a same base coat. For the highlights, I used a Thousand Suns blue mixed with the Night Lord's blue and just brightened it up a little bit. On the shield, I used a watered down paint. You can see here it's still a bit wet because then the colors blend together quite nicely. I did another highlight, also watered down some Thousand Suns blue to create an extra layer of depth in there. And you leave those recessed areas, the edges of the shield, nice and dark blue. The metal parts, I gave a primer of lead belcher. So the chainmail, there's quite some. I gave it a shade with some Nuln Oil. And next I started with the gold parts, Liberator Gold, because it's nice and bright gold. It looks kind of aged. I really like the color on this one. So for this, the entire shield is painted with this as a base coat, as well as most of his armor. On the shield, I focused on the front. I gave the edges a gold shiny look, and I left the back side as it's supposed to be a wooden shield, probably. It's not entirely metal, I guess. I'm not sure. You can choose whatever you want. Next, I used lead belcher on the sword. His sword is quite simple, but elegant looking, I guess. Next, I used dried bark and Abaddon black to paint the fur parts of his inner robes. There's a little robe under his cloak. Next I used some Mechanicus Standard Grey on his beard and hair. He has a massive beard with some chains in it. Don't worry too much about those, we'll fix it later. As I said, I used Night Lord's Blue on the crown as well, because I'm going to try and do some gold edges to make it a little more a piece to look at. I used some non-oil on the beard to create some shade. And the hair, of course. Next, I mixed Mechanicus Standard Grey and Administratum Grey to highlight those hairs. Focus on the top parts. It can be quite a dark beard, but you want to have some bright highlights. So some of the hairs I picked out on top of his head, on the back of his head, of course, and the mustache mainly, and the top of the beard. Next, I used pure Administratum Grey to give it another highlight and give it an even more bright look. Next, Abaddon Black is used to darken down the chains if needed. And I used Liberator Gold to touch all the connecting points in the chain. So every corner, and also some of his hair is put up in some, what do you call that? Metal ornament of sorts. I don't know what it's called. And I highlighted the edges, the very edges of the crown. So just the top, the bottom. You can add a third layer if you're very, very brave. So I use a thin point to try and achieve that. So use a fine detail brush if you have one, and try and add some of those details on there. For the cloak, I mixed Rhinox hide with Abaddon Black to give it a nice dark brown look. Now you let that dry for a minute, and in the meanwhile you can pick out the gold details in the cloak with Liberator Gold. I also painted the edges of the chainmail with a Liberator Gold look, just give it a nice golden brim, and the inner part of the sword. It's not really sharp, as you can see here, but the inside part of the sword is painted with gold as well. Next, we're going to highlight this Liberator Gold with Storm Host Silver and give it a nice bright edge. All the golden parts I highlighted with just a tiny bit. The top of the shield, the top of the sword, the top of the gloves, etc. Next, I wanted to create a little shade using some Reichland Flesh shade on the gold metal parts. When I finished this, I used Black Templar to darken down the cloak, and I watered it down quite a bit just before I did this, otherwise it will be really black, and I want it to be a brown cloak, but to have some nice natural shading. I used Steel Legion Drab with a dry brush to create a first highlight stage on this darkened cloak. Make sure your brush is very dry with barely any paint on it. It's better to go over it twice or 3 times or maybe 10 times than one too much, because you get a blob of paint. I wanted to give it an old look, so I used Administratum Grey on some of the bottom parts and the top parts to make it look worn. I mean, he's been king for quite a while, and he's a dwarf. He's practical, right? He doesn't need a new cloak every week, so he's used it quite a lot. I guessed. I mean, I wasn't there. I did it in an extreme form with some Administratum Grey, just the very tips of the bottom of the cloak to make it a little more brighter at those points. And then your model is nearly finished. For the bottom I used some pieces of cork. Just tore them apart, glued them to the base, and you get some nice rocks. That's quite an easy way to create a rocky base if you want. I just glued them there, painted them with Mechanicus Standard Grey to blend in with the base. And next I'm going to be spicing up the base a little bit. I want it to be rocky for the main part. I mean, he lives in a mountain, right? So some null oil to create some nice shading on our newly created rocks, and some Administratum Grey to highlight the edges of those rocks. You can go even brighter if you want, depending on how you want your rocks to look. And that's it for this model. Thror, King under the mountain, King of Erebor, leader of the dwarves for well, a good number of years before he was finally evicted from his home by the dragon Smaug. I really love how he turned out, and I thank you so much for watching again. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel, and I hope to see you in one of my next videos. Bye bye!